Hey everybody, so the time has come to upgrade the Cube Computer Plexi. We're going to be upgrading this system to a newer motherboard, a SATA AM4 motherboard with 16 gigabytes of DDR4 memory. We're going to be going from the AMD Phenom II 6-core 1045T processor to the AMD Ryzen 7 1700X CPU from the MidTower Deluxe. So we'll also be going from a 256 gig SATA SSD to a 256 gig M.2 NVMe SSD. So that being said, it's time to shut this thing down and get started. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to pull this CPU core, because we're going to be transferring that over to the new setup. And with these AMD processors, at least the ones that have the pins on the CPU, it's a good practice to give the cooler a little back and forth wiggle before you pull up, because I have on several occasions pulled a CPU right out of the socket. It's going to pull our graphics card, which we will be transferring over to the new setup. Now I should note this graphics card is not very powerful. It is a it's a GeForce GT640 1GB card. So not all that great, but for this system I'm not really doing much in any way of graphics. Maybe video editing once in a while, but honestly down the road I do intend on eventually maybe going to a Ryzen APU on this system. Who knows? Let's go ahead and disconnect everything here. So our DVD drive uses the ID interface. I'm going to talk about how I'm going to utilize that drive on a new setup. It's going to actually be kind of interesting. It only costs me about $10 for an adapter. And it might not be what you're thinking. And what's cool is, well, what's funny here is these freaking ASUS motherboards. I don't know if they're still doing this with the brand new ones, but this here aggravates me. Like, why can't you just use the stock, or let's say the standardized pinout for your front buttons and LEDs? Like, how difficult is that? That shouldn't be too difficult to do, but here we are. Alright, so let me look at the new motherboard real quick. I'm just looking to make sure that our connections are long enough, and they should be, because it's right on the corner of the new board, thankfully. Now, one thing we will be changing out, in addition to what I mentioned earlier, is the card reader. So we're going to be going from this cheap USB 2.0 media card reader to this Bi-Easy USB 3 hub with a SD reader and USB-C port on the front that I pulled from the PortaCube system last night. So we're going to be sticking that in here. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and, of course, gotta get this off here. We'll be keeping the same power supply, at least I do intend to anyway. It should be sufficient enough for what we're putting on here. It's going to be about the same power draw, maybe a little less. And disconnect this fan here. Okay, let's go ahead and get this board out. So it's been a little while since I installed this motherboard. I had to look back to see what year it was. I think it's 2019 or 2020. Alright, so it's going to pop out the ISO plate from the old motherboard. Usually just a back end of screwdriver is enough to get those out. And you always got to be careful with these things because they will cut you. Trust me how I know. It's happened to me at least a couple of times. It always seems that when it's with cheap computer cases, that's when you're more likely to get cut. This went right in. Alright, let's go ahead and drop in a new motherboard. Let's make sure all the holes line up. They should all line up okay. So this motherboard tray is from a 2000 HP system. Yeah, year 2000 HP computer. One of the really small HP systems from back in the day. And it's perfect for this Plexi computer. Make sure we're all lined up here. Alright, let's go ahead and fasten this new motherboard into place. Okay, let's go ahead and start reconnecting stuff. And our power reset button and disk and power LEDs all reach okay so far. At least those reach. How about our USB connections? Oh, I should note this here is our card reader that we're changing, so we're not going to put that back in there. Let's go ahead and snap this zip tie here. Let these cables dangle free. And get this cable out of the mix. Alright, that should be enough to get the card reader out. Okay, so to interface with the IDE optical drive that's on the Plexi, we're going to be adding in this roughly like $8 to $10 IDE to USB adapter. Normally what this will be used for is to connect a IDE or SATA optical drive or hard disk drive to a system externally, but what I did is I scavenged this internal single USB 2 to USB-A connection, so that way I didn't have to cut this off and rewire anything. So what we're going to do is we're going to install this onto the motherboard, just like that. I'm just going to feed this around through the underside of this top deck of the system. That way I can connect everything up later for our optical disk drive. Alright, so on a side note, of course we already have our CPU installed, got a RAM installed, also got our M.2 SSD installed there. Let's go ahead and swap out the CPU cooler because we are using the heat pipe cooler from the old setup. Cools a lot better and is a lot quieter than this. This was intended to be temporary, just for testing this motherboard. So this motherboard is the motherboard that I recently repaired. I got this motherboard on eBay for less than 30 bucks shipped, and well, it was a parts only motherboard, and the seller did not know what was wrong with it. And from the image, it was not really apparent what was wrong. When it showed up at my front door, in the box was this motherboard, along with a horrific soldering job here, and a brand new BIOS chip still in the package from, like, let's say DigiKey or wherever. And I have a couple of videos on how I resurrected this motherboard, if you want to check those out. Let's go ahead and clean our processor. So I should note this started out as a really cheap Sunbeam heat pipe cooler, and the surface on this used to be very bad. Now it's still not the greatest, but I was able to successfully lap this cooler to where it's a lot smoother, and I have a video that discusses why a smooth surface on your cooler is more than just pretty looks. It helps improve thermal transfer between your processor and your cooler. So we're going to follow up here with some isopropyl alcohol on both surfaces. Alrighty, so I'm going to apply some fresh thermal compound. And put a nice little dot in the center here. Sometimes I spread it out, sometimes I just put a big blob in the center and let the heat and the pressure do its job. Alright. It's funny, I should note that we have a fan that is from an Intel CPU cooler from roughly the mid-2000s. Probably an old Pentium 4, Pentium D cooler, something like that. You have a couple little twists there. And plug our fan in. Okay, so we're going to be plugging in all but this yellow SATA cable, because that yellow SATA cable goes to the 2.5-inch drive, the SATA SSD. So these red connections are to the 2 hard drives on the Plexi, and these blue connections are to the accessible hot swap SATA connections that I use to plug up to hard drives and SSDs to back up data and wipe drives, all that good stuff I do with this thing. Yeah, these these really long SATA cables from mid-2000s, late 2000s Dell towers, they come in handy for stuff like this. Alright, so before I plug up our power supply, I want to verify that our 5-volt standby rail is working okay on this unit. This power supply, I think, might possibly have a 2-transistor 5-volt standby circuit on it. And of course, a lot of older power supplies had 2-transistor 5-volt standby circuits. The one that was most infamous was the eMachine's Mobo Killer, Bestech ATX 25012E. Because it was such a poorly designed 2-transistor 5-volt standby circuit. And the way you can check a 5-volt standby circuit on a unit like this is to just measure the 5-volt standby when the power supply is powered up, or at least when it gets power from mains. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get our meter set up here. Going to probe the black meter lead to the ground wire or black wire, and the red wire is going to the 5-volt standby. I'm going to power this power supply up and see what it does. It came right up to 5.19. Okay, so it looks like we're okay. So if the 5-volt standby circuit was failing, it would overshoot to like 6, 7, 8 volts or something like that, and then gradually fall down. I have a video from many years back of an Antec power supply doing this. So this power supply, I have 2 of them, and they're branded as Dynapower USA, but they're actually OEM by a company called Wintec. And I recapped both these PSUs many years ago. This one's on Plexi, the other one's in the MidTower Deluxe Black Max. Alright, just make sure that's powered off. Alright, let's go ahead and connect this back up. Or connect it up rather. Now on the subject of CPU power connections, you might notice that this power supply has just a 4-pin connection. Now, this motherboard, of course, has an 8-pin connection. And you're probably thinking, okay, you need to have an 8-pin PSU connection here. The truth really is, in that regard, it really depends on what kind of processor you have installed on here. This CPU, the Ryzen 7 1700X, is a 95-watt TDP processor. And of course, back when I started building computers back in 2006, we had, of course, the Phenom D processor, which was a very power-hungry CPU, and of course the Phenom 4. Those were very power-hungry processors, and back then we were still running 4-pin CPU power connections off power supplies. The EPS 12-volt connection didn't really seem to show up until, I don't know, 08, 09 on some motherboards. Now, for example, the motherboard I have in the Cube Computer Porta-Cube system only has a 4-pin connection, and you might have noticed that the motherboard, which is a socket AM3 board I pulled off of this system, only had a 4-pin CPU power connection, not an 8-pin. And I think in the documentation for that motherboard it specifies it's limited to a 95-watt TDP processor. So my rule of thumb, 95 watts or less, you can get by with a 4-pin power connection. If it's over 95 watts, let's say 125 watts, definitely use the 8-pin. Now if your power supply provides 8 pins, use them all. But if it doesn't, just know that you really shouldn't exceed 95 watt TDP on this style connection. Now I should note that TDP stands for thermal design power. It does not necessarily mean that the CPU only pulls up to 95 watts. It can pull more, but still, it's just a rule of thumb that I use. So that being said, it's going to continue on. Let's go ahead and put the graphics card in here. So, of course, the Ryzen 7 1700X does not have built-in graphics. It's not an APU. It does require an external graphics card. So we're going to install the card we had on here, which I installed this back, I forget what year it was I put this in here. And like I say, this system, I don't really do anything that's hardcore graphics on this one, so it's not a really big deal. But of course in the future, if I do swap out for a Ryzen APU, I will be pulling this off here and just using the Ryzen APU graphics. So let's go ahead and get this fastened in. Okay, now let's go ahead and focus on the CD drive as well as the front card reader. Okay, since I have the Plexi pulled out, you can see this memorial on the back of the system. It's in memory of my high school computer engineering teacher, Mr. Michael Healy. This man was part of the reason I got into, or I stayed interested in computers. And of course, there's quite a story about him, and I may cover that in a future video, which I may have covered it in the past on this channel. But I will be talking about it further sometime in this coming year, because 2026 will be the 20th year of Cube Computer Company. Now, of course, it's not the amount of time I spent on YouTube on this channel, but Cube Computer Company became a thing in 2006, and it started right here with this computer right here, which back then originally was called the Cube Computer 1, and then in 2007 I started calling it the Cube Computer Plexi. Alright, so let's go ahead and disconnect our ID cable. I think my viewers on here are old enough to remember working with these all the time. You think cable management is bad now? Ha! Ha! Yeah. Trying to organize these things? Yeah, not always easy. Now this one here is actually not that bad because it's a lot more flexible. Funny thing is, this actually came from an E-machine system. It was one of the E-machine systems that was manufactured by FIC. I'm going to spin this thing around toward the front. You got to be careful handling this thing because I don't want to risk breaking a seam. Because this thing is actually held together with hot glue. Alright, so let's get this card reader right here, and to do that we're going to need a pocket knife to cut the glue where it's glued into place. Now when I put this stuff in here, I didn't like go extremely insane with the glue. Because I didn't want to make this thing impossible to get out when it came time to replace it. But I will say, sometimes getting stuff out of this thing can be a little sketchy. See, the front bezel is trying to pop off of it there. This easy does it. Because ideally I'd like to save this card reader for installation on a different system, which will be a conventional computer, not a computer held together with hot glue and made of acrylic. So yeah, the Cube Computer Plexi was a high school project for the computer engineering class. All the students in the class built these things, or built their own variants of them. I can't say they were all the same because they were not. And it was basically, we got the school, Charlotte Mecklenburg Schools was nice enough to donate the computers, the X computers, the retired computers from the computer lab, and we got to build these computers using those parts, which the Plexi used to be built out of parts from a compact Desk Pro EM system from roughly 2000 or 2001. Originally had an Intel Phenom III 933 MHz processor, 20 gig hard drive, probably 256 megs of RAM, something like that. It wasn't a lot to start with. And this thing originally came home from school with Windows 98 SE on it. Yes, it did. Alright, so we got that out of there. And it came out relatively clean. So I'm going to peel this out of here and we'll get the hot glue gun heating up. That way we can install the replacement card reader. Okay, so I got the glue out of here. And we have a good clean spot. So before I actually install this, I need to also take out the SSD. Yes, I'm having to use a flat blade screwdriver. But like I mentioned, when I glued this in here, I used a very small amount of glue. See, it just popped off right there. Very little effort at all. Alright, so I basically hid this SSD inside this thing. That was the advantage of it being a 2.5-inch drive. Alright, so right there was a little bitty blot of glue that I used to secure this on there. You can see it came right off. So there we go. Now I gotta cut another cable zip tie so I can get that yellow SATA cable out of there, since we are not using it anymore. Yeah, the reason why I chose to go with an ID to USB adapter for this DVD drive is because this motherboard has just 4 SATA ports on it. And also the cost of getting the adapter, the ID to USB adapter, would be cheaper than buying a SATA to ID interface. Alright, so now that we got that out of the way, let's go ahead and get our replacement USB 3 hub / card reader in there. Now I should note this replacement card reader only supports micro SD and SD. It does not support, of course, all the old legacy cards like compact flash or micro drive, XD, memory stick, all those. But I do have an old card reader that's external that has all of those built in should I ever need that. So I'm just going to feed all this in here. Now I did want to mention one more thing before I slide this all the way in. The Buy Easy 3.5-inch card reader / hub has this SATA power connection on it. This product has a design flaw to where the 5-volt connection on the SATA power connection is tied to the 5-volt connection on the USB power connection. That's a big no-no. Because what happens is, as I demonstrated in a video from 2022, when this was briefly installed, and when I first installed this in the BoardCube and briefly had the SATA power connection hooked up, it was actually causing 5-volt power from the 5-volt rail to backfeed into the USB power, which was actually causing the 5-volt standby rail, which was powering the USB ports, to backfeed every 5-volt device in the system. That wasn't good. Alright, so what we'll do now is let's go ahead and secure this into place. Now, since this is actually set up a bit different, whereas this here is completely rectangular, like it resembles a full like drive. This, however, does not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a small blob of glue on this, and then also a small blob of glue on the acrylic. That way we can have something for this to adhere to. Try to get this lined up as good as I can. So again, the goal is to make it where this can be removed relatively easily. but also be secure enough for regular use. Alright, so it looks like it's lined up well with the optical drive, so I think we're good to go there. And the USB connection on the back is plenty long enough to reach the motherboard. Okay, now it's time to go ahead and prep our optical drive. So I think what I'm going to do is, since we have plenty of cable already down here, matter of fact our USB port is right here waiting for us, I'll just use a zip tie to tie up this extra cable on this. That way we won't have a whole bunch of slack. Okay, so I got a zip tie on there. So I'm going to go ahead and plug this into the USB port here. This will get connected to the drive. And now, first we have to make sure that we're on master. The jumper has to be on master. So we're already on master, so yeah, master is required for this to function. If it's on slave or cable select, you'll have to move the jumper over to master. So go ahead and plug this in and reconnect our power supply connection. Okay, so this drive will continue to function as normal. In fact, you'll be able to boot CDs off of it. CDs or DVDs, you'll still be able to boot this thing off of CDs or DVDs with that. It'll still function just like an ID drive. And honestly, the speed of this is not very fast to begin with. So I don't think it's going to be much of an impact having it transferring data over USB 2.0. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and try to zip tie these cables up a little bit. That way they're not such a mess. Try to put it back like the way it was. Okay. So I should note that the new motherboard here supports RGB LEDs. So in the future I'm going to add RGB lighting to the Plexi. I think that'll make it look really cool. Alright, it's time to give this thing a test. Okay everybody, it's time for the first power on. Well, after I cut this cable tie, or zip tie. Alright, let's see what this thing's got. There we are. Okay, there we are in the SAP utility. It sees our memory, and of course got our Ryzen 7 1700X processor. I tell you what, this room is getting to be such a cluster. From working on power supply units to just other random projects going on, I gotta pause, take a break, and just get this room back in order. Okay, so we're looking in the hardware monitor utility, and I should note that this kind of rule of thumb that I've used over the years is you can't exactly rely on voltage readouts that are in the BIOS. Usually it's better to hook up a multimeter to check those, but everything looks okay. That 3.3 volt looks a little high, but I mean, this power supply was running the previous setup just fine. I'm not really concerned about that here. Now I should note that Ryzen processors, they do tend to run warm, or appear to run warm when you're looking at them in the BIOS. Okay, so we're in the storage part of the SAP utility, and we can see that it's detecting our NVMe drive just fine. Also it sees our two hard drives, which were set up in a RAID 1 configuration on this previous setup. Now I should note that I backed up all the contents of my data drive because I was planning on having to just completely rebuild the RAID array on this setup, because we went from an AMD 880G motherboard to this motherboard, which has the B450 chipset, or B450 South Bridge. So definitely a different setup. So I remember with the MidTower Deluxe when I did the upgrade to it back in 2017, 2018, and we went from an 890FX setup to the X370, and I had to rebuild my RAID configuration after that upgrade. But we're going to leave this set to HCI mode for now, because I just want to see if our existing Windows 11 will boot on this. So I've reconnected our SATA SSD to see if this system will boot off of that. I'm prepared to wipe and reinstall Windows if I have to. So that being said, let's go ahead and save changes and exit. Okay, let's see what happens here. Huh. Looks like it's going to be a go. Now I should note we have Windows 11 23H2 currently on this SATA SSD, because the previous setup did not meet the hard requirements for Windows 11 24H2 or newer, and of course didn't meet the Microsoft Elite class system requirements for Windows 11. It's funny, the quote-unquote new setup also does not meet the Microsoft Elite class system requirements. So therefore, at this time, the Cube Computer Plexi cannot join officially the Microsoft Elite class club of PCs. But we're running Windows 11 anyway, so the heck with that, Elite class or not. Now, of course, the Porta-Cube system and now the MidTower Deluxe have joined the Elite class club, because their CPUs are new enough to meet the Microsoft Elite class requirements, and of course that's my nickname for the Windows 11 system requirements. The official system requirements, not what you actually need to run the OS. Alright, so it looks like we're going to get in. Now, there's a couple of things we want to do at some point. We're going to need to do an MBR to GPT conversion, but I'm going to do that after I copy the contents of the SATA SSD to the new NVMe SSD. That's my plan anyway. Alright, we're in. We have working sound, as I heard. So that's nice to see that our eBay motherboard that we was able to resurrect and fix appears to be working okay. Alright, now the thing is, since we're changing motherboards, we most likely will lose Windows activation. So if I have to, I'll have to purchase another license for Windows, but I'll deal with that at a later time. But here we are at the desktop. That's a good sign. Let's see what we have here for our device manager. I was thinking we'd have a whole bunch of unknowns in here, but it's looking like it's picked almost everything up. So, yeah, now I should note I will have to, once I copy the data from the SATA SSD to the NVMe drive, I will have to then go in and install the RAID drivers. We'll actually then enable RAID and then go in and install the drivers, and then we'll see if it's able to pick up our existing array. Otherwise, we'll have to rebuild it. Okay, everybody, so I did end up having to recreate the RAID array on the hard drives in this system. It's a good thing I have the backup of all the files on the MidTower Deluxe, that way I can restore everything once I'm done. So I recreated the array. I still need to install the RAID drivers for this, but before we go any further, I'm going to go ahead and do an MBR to GPT conversion. So the way it's going to work is we're going to just boot into the Windows installer to do that. Okay, so let's go ahead and press Shift and F10 at the same time. Alright, there's our command prompt. Let's go ahead and run this part just to confirm that disk 0 is our SSD, as it should be. And there we are. Alright. So let's go ahead and run MBR to GPT. We'll do a validation first. Completed validation successfully. So let's go and do the conversion. Alright. Now we'll just go ahead and boot off of that SSD. Let's go ahead and just reset the system. Take a little shortcut there. But now we're at the desktop, and the reason why it's getting this pop-up here is because my D drive is currently, well, not there. So the desktop is currently not available, at least the icons are not. But what we're going to do is we need to install some drivers for the RAID controller. Pretty sure they're missing. Yep, there they are. So we're going to test out the DVD drive, because the needed RAID drivers are on this CD. And we can see that our DVD drive is working like normal. Alright, so let's go ahead and access that. Make sure we go to open and not the autoplay function. Alright, so drivers. So this is the folder we need to go to. It's funny, it's titled Serial ATA for Floppy Disk. But the drivers we need are actually in here. So I'll just copy this information, and then we'll go over here to RAID controller, update driver, browse the computer, put that information in there, and there we are. And then we'll have to do that for the rest of these. Well, it was already there, of course. Let's keep doing this until they're done. So now let me go see if in computer management, or disk management rather, see if we see a new volume. As you can see, we now have our new volume. Now I can set up as NPR or GPT. Now if it's like over 2 terabytes, then yeah, you would have to use GPT, but we'll just set up NVR for this. Create a new volume. Next. Assign it the D letter. Yep. And we'll call it data. We'll let that format, and it's ready for use. So now I just gotta go in and start copying files back over. Okay, and while that data is copying over, I want to show y'all something really funny here. So I mentioned earlier that I wasn't sure about the Windows activation, but lo and behold, it's activated. So perhaps this motherboard came from a system that was running Windows 10 Pro or Windows 11 Pro. I don't know. Typically when you change a motherboard like this, it breaks your Windows activation, because that's typically tied to the system motherboard. At least that's from my experience. So who knows? Maybe maybe this motherboard had a Windows license tied to it. Who knows? But it's showing activated right now. I'm not kidding you. I hadn't touched the license at all. It's just showing activated. Crazy stuff. Alright, so we're going to let this stuff finish copying over, and I think this system will be good to go. Look, everybody, so I have finished copying the data back over to our data partition on the hard drives, which are in the RAID 1 setup. And also off camera I have went in and got this machine upgraded to Windows 11 25H2. That involved a bit of work. That's something to cover in a future video on how I did that with this system. It has a Ryzen 7 1700X, which of course does not meet the Microsoft Elite Class system requirements for Windows 11. But normally, on systems that don't meet the system requirements for Windows 11, I can still force upgrade them to the newer Windows 11. But this machine did not want to go without a fight. The MidTower Deluxe was the same way too before I recently upgraded it. Not sure if it's due to that Ryzen 7 1700X processor, or if it's due to perhaps the RAID setup on this machine. Of course, MidTower Deluxe also has RAID enabled. But when you would go to force upgrade Windows 11, so when it would go to restart, it would get into the boot animation and then crash in blue screen or black screen with the inaccessible boot device stop error. Could have been a driver issue, not certain, but I did end up getting this to go. Kind of a process. I actually went back to the SATA SSD and then attempted to do a force upgrade on this, while also having RAID disabled and my hard drives disconnected, and it did successfully go that time. And then I was able to successfully re-enable RAID, install the RAID drivers, all that stuff. Like I said, it's a bit of a process, but anyways, I have discovered one limitation to this newer setup versus what this thing had, and it has to do with hot swapping with the SATA controller in RAID mode. So the previous motherboard, which has the I think it's the AMD 880G chipset, not sure what Southbridge has off the top of my head, but that motherboard, even with the RAID controller enabled and with a RAID setup in place, you could still do hot swapping or hot ports with the additional SATA cables. With this new motherboard, you can't do that. So ultimately what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to install an add-on card. It's a PCI Express add-on card with some SATA ports to have some separate SATA ports from the motherboard's ports, which are currently in RAID. So let's go and get that done real quick here. Okay, so we're going to add this SATA expansion card. This wasn't much on Amazon. It was like maybe 15 bucks, something like that. It gives you 4 SATA 3.0 ports. And they're even nice enough to give you a screwdriver and some screws. Even a black one to match your case if you have a black screw. I got a handful of these little screwdrivers now. They come with everything, it seems like. And they also provide a low profile slot for slim cases. But we're using this the regular old full size slot, and of course the card is in the bag. Going to get that out. So pretty straightforward. Just a little PCI Express add-in card with 4 SATA jacks. We're going to take out this last slot cover. So go ahead and install the card into place. Okay, so now we're going to disconnect our 2 blue SATA cables. Alright, I'm going to have to unbundle these from the rest of them there. I'm just going to plug these into the card. So I should note what I had seen online on the Amazon listing. I think this card does not support UEFI booting if you're intending on actually using this to boot a device. But for our application, we're only using it for, or for the most part, we're just using it for accessing drives for general stuff, not actually booting the system off of the drive itself. I'm going to tie up these cables. I'll do that at a later time. Alright, so we have 2 more ports available if we ever need them. Pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead and turn this thing back on. I'm going to install a registry fix to stop this stupid pop-up from coming up, because Microsoft just wants everybody to use Microsoft account with their computer. But anyways, let's go ahead and verify that our new add-on SATA controller is being seen. Okay, so I actually had to connect up a SATA device to more or less wake up the card. So we can see it is preparing now. I just hooked up a hard disk drive to it. There's our add-on drive right there, the one I just hooked up. So yeah, it's kind of weird how that works. But you see we have a little LED there showing that we have a device hooked up. So it has 4 different LEDs. One for each SATA port. So we have confirmed the hot swapping does work. For example, so if I go to computer, we can see the contents of that hard drive. So that's exactly what we want here. So now we have proper functioning SATA hot swap. That way I can hook up SATA devices on the fly while the system's running, just like I could before. So yeah, pretty impressed so far. Haven't really shown much otherwise, but yeah, we have the repaired motherboard installed on a Cube Computer Plexi, and it's way faster than that Phenom II 6-core, and it also draws less power and puts out less heat. I've noticed this thing runs cooler, and yeah, really impressed. So the Plexi has been upgraded. So anyways, that's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.